army surrounding the temple was supposed to be his. The soldiers outside Honnō-ji wore his colors. They carried his weapons. They had been paid from the system he had spent 30 years building, and they had come to kill him. Oda Nobunaga had survived armies larger than his own. He had destroyed rivals who should have defeated him. He had broken alliances, challenged institutions, and shattered conventions that had kept Japan locked in a century of civil war. By June 1582, he was closer than anyone had been in 100 years to the impossible, uniting Japan. Then, at the moment when victory was finally within reach, one of his own commanders turned his army toward Kyoto, not toward the enemy, toward Nobunaga. The question isn't how he died. The question is how a man who had spent his entire life learning to see threats before they appeared failed to see the one standing beside him. Drawn from history. Japan had been fighting itself for more than a century. The Sengoku period had produced a country where the central government existed mostly in name. The emperor held prestige without power. Every province was controlled by warlords who understood one rule above everything. Today's ally is tomorrow's enemy. Loyalty was conditional. Power was temporary. Survival belonged to whoever could see the next move first. Nobunaga was born in 1534, the son of a minor lord in Owari. When his father died in 1551, he inherited a fragmented domain and something almost as dangerous: the contempt of his own people. His retainers called him Owari no Outsuk, the fool of Owari. He wandered the streets carelessly. He ignored the ceremonies his position required. He behaved, by every measure of the era, like someone who didn't understand the weight of what he'd been given. He understood it completely. What looked like disorder to the men around him was something more difficult to understand. Nobunaga had already begun treating the world as something that could be changed rather than inherited. He did not seem interested in becoming the lord his father had been. He seemed determined to become something the old order had never made room for. The rules they were protecting were the reason Japan remained trapped. He wasn't interested in playing the old game better. He intended to end it. The first time Japan saw what that meant was at Okehazama in 1560. Imagawa Yoshimoto was advancing with 25,000 men. Nobunaga had approximately 2,000. Every rational calculation said submit or flee. He attacked. He didn't try to defeat 25,000 soldiers. He went for one man. He gathered intelligence on Yoshimoto's position, identified the terrain advantage a sudden summer storm would create, and drove directly at the headquarters while the larger army was still processing what was happening. Imagawa Yoshimoto died in the confusion. 25,000 soldiers, leaderless, dissolved. For the men who had expected Nobunaga to retreat, the victory must have looked almost impossible to explain. He had not won because he possessed the larger army. He had won because, for a few decisive minutes, he had made the larger army irrelevant. Japan noticed something it hadn't fully understood before. Nobunaga didn't fight the way other warlords fought. He changed the problem, found the question nobody else was asking, and moved before anyone could respond. That would become his signature. He reached Kyoto in 1568, supporting Ashikaga Yoshiaki, the last claimant to the shogunate. Nobunaga understood that legitimacy was a weapon. He could control the capital while appearing to restore order rather than impose his own. The arrangement lasted as long as it was useful. When Yoshiaki began building his own alliances and issuing orders Nobunaga hadn't approved, the fiction stopped serving its purpose. Nobunaga expelled him from Kyoto in 1573. He didn't replace him. He let the shogunate die. That decision was larger than it appeared. Nobunaga wasn't simply trying to become the most powerful warlord in Japan. He was trying to make the old definition of power irrelevant, and every institution he dismantled taught the men watching him the same lesson. No position was truly protected. No boundary was sacred. Power belonged to whoever was willing to take it. He was teaching Japan to think like Nobunaga. The Buddhist institutions were not merely places of worship. They controlled land, commanded armed followers, wielded political influence that had survived centuries of warfare. In 1571, Nobunaga burned Enryaku-ji. The accounts describe thousands of deaths, the surrounding communities destroyed, the mountain burning through the night. The message was deliberate. Tradition would not protect you. Religious authority would not protect you. The age of an institution would not protect you. If something stood between Nobunaga and what he was building, it would be removed. But something else was happening simultaneously, something he may not have fully calculated. Every time Nobunaga proved that no rule was absolute, he was also telling the men closest to him that the rules protecting him were no different from the ones he had already destroyed. He was building an empire. He was also quietly dismantling the barriers that kept that empire safe. At Nagashino in 1575, he deployed thousands of arquebusiers in coordinated rotating volleys behind defensive palisades. The Takeda cavalry, feared across Japan, charged into continuous fire they had never encountered in that form. The charge was shattered. The point wasn't the gun. It was that Nobunaga had understood what the technology could become before his enemies knew what was happening. He built the system, trained the men, and chose the position while his opponents were still thinking in the old terms. He saw change first, then moved before anyone could adapt. It made him extraordinarily difficult to defeat on any battlefield he chose. His enemies had learned to fear his speed. His soldiers had learned to trust his certainty. His allies had learned that his promises were useful only while they served his larger purpose. And the men closest to him had learned something else. Nobunaga did not believe that anything was permanent, but battlefield intelligence could not protect him from what was already forming inside his own ranks. By 1582, the project was close. Major rivals had been broken or absorbed. Religious opposition was suppressed. His generals were advancing into the remaining territories. The fragmented domain he had inherited in Owari was becoming something that had seemed impossible when he started. He had spent 30 years looking outward, at armies, at rival clans, at institutions to be dismantled and enemies to be eliminated. The threats in front of him had consumed everything, and perhaps that was precisely when he was most exposed, because what would end his life was not outside his empire. Akechi Mitsuhide was one of his senior commanders, intelligent, cultured, militarily capable. He'd served Nobunaga faithfully for years. The sources record public humiliations, whether those caused what followed, or whether ambition, fear, calculation, or something the sources don't preserve was the real force. Nobody can say with certainty. The sources preserve only what happened. Mitsuhide was ordered to march west to support another campaign. He went south instead, toward Kyoto, toward Honnō-ji. Nobunaga was there with almost no protection. A small personal retinue, the kind of minimal guard appropriate for a man resting in his own territory, in a city he controlled. With his armies already in the field against external threats, he had no reason to expect what was coming. Then the army appeared outside the temple. The soldiers were wearing his colors. For a moment, perhaps longer, that detail created confusion. His colors, his weapons, an army that looked in every visible way like part of the empire he had built. Then the direction they were facing became impossible to misread. What happened inside Honnō-ji is recorded in fragments. Nobunaga fought with arrows first, then with a naginata when the arrows were exhausted, then with a sword when the confined space made the longer weapon impossible. The temple was burning. Outside, the men who had followed him for years were closing in. Inside, the space around him was disappearing. There was no battlefield to control now, no formation to break, no enemy flank to exploit, no distant army waiting for the right moment. For once, Nobunaga could not change the conditions of the fight. The man who had spent 30 years choosing his ground, selecting terrain, controlling approach routes, designing the conditions of every engagement, was running out of space. He retreated into an inner chamber. His body was never recovered. Whether he died from wounds, from fire, or by his own hand remains unresolved. The man who had built himself into something impossible to ignore left behind no identifiable remains. Mitsuhide's forces searched the ruins. Nothing. Within days, Toyotomi Hideyoshi reversed his own campaign, marched his army back at speed that astonished everyone who calculated the distance, and defeated Mitsuhide at Yamazaki. Mitsuhide had controlled Japan for 13 days. Hideyoshi would eventually complete much of what Nobunaga had begun. Not in Nobunaga's way, but along the path Nobunaga had cleared. Through the structures Nobunaga had broken, the man who finished the work was someone else. Nobunaga never saw the Japan that would emerge from his victories. He never saw the order his destruction made possible. He died before the transformation could bear his name. That is the paradox at the center of Nobunaga's story. He succeeded because he destroyed the rules that had kept Japan static. He moved before other people were ready. He dismantled institutions everyone else considered untouchable. But in destroying those rules, he created a world where the rules protecting him could be destroyed too. Mitsuhide didn't need to defeat Nobunaga the way Nobunaga had defeated his enemies. He only needed to understand that he didn't have to. Nobunaga had armies, territory, fear, momentum. What he didn't have was a Japan in which turning south instead of west was unimaginable. He had survived Japan's armies. He had survived its institutions. He had survived its strongest warlords. But he could not survive the world he was creating. The same quality that made him impossible to stop made him possible to betray. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please subscribe and leave a like. You can also write in the comments which historical topics you'd like to see next. See you in the next video.